Freeze drying herbs is a fantastic method to preserve their potency and flavor for a really long time. Usually you'll hear a lot of information about drying or dehydrating herbs. So what's so different about freeze drying them? Here are 3 top reasons you should be freeze drying your herbs. Number 1, freeze drying retains more nutrients compared to other drying methods. Your herbs will almost be just as potent as they were fresh. Number 2, the process keeps the flavors intact, making your culinary creations with your very own herbs taste even better than they would dried or dehydrated. And number 3, freeze-dried herbs can last for years when stored properly, meaning less waste and more savings for you. Some of the other benefits of freeze-drying your herbs are the versatility of them. Freeze-dried herbs can be rehydrated quickly or used as is in recipes. There's also no need for preservatives or chemicals. So in the end, you're able to preserve your freshly grown herbs as naturally as possible. Now that you know that freeze drying is the absolute best method to preserve your herbs, let's talk about the process of freeze drying. So the first step is obviously having fresh herbs. You can either grow them in your own garden or you can find them on sale in grocery stores sometimes. And when you cut them down like this, harvesting in late spring or early summer, they actually continue to grow and bloom again. As you can see here, I like to grow calendula, chamomile, oregano, thyme, and many more. I use all of these herbs in cooking, in teas, tinctures, and even in skincare. You can absolutely use these fresh, but I found it really hard to use this amount of herbs fresh, so I like to preserve them by freeze drying. Then I can use them all throughout the year without worry of them going bad. Now that you've gathered all your herbs, you can go ahead and strip any stemmed herbs like my oregano or thyme. You can also just leave it on the stem if you'd like. It's kind of based on personal preference. After the freeze drying process, it is pretty simple to destem them. You want to use kind of a drying rack and shake them up in there, and then you can remove the stems. I like to destem before the freeze drying process just so that I have more room on my trays to freeze dry more herbs. The next step is to get rid of any bugs or dust or dirt from the herbs. So we're going to use some filtered water and a little white vinegar and let that soak for 3 to 5 minutes and then rinse off. Some other options are just using plain filtered water or baking soda along with filtered water, or you can just leave them flat on a tray and sometimes the bugs will take care of themselves. But my favorite method is to use white vinegar and distilled water. Once they're all clean, you can pat them dry, and there are 2 methods after this. Some people like to pre-freeze anything they're putting in their freeze dryer. This is just putting these herbs on a tray and then sticking them in the freezer to freeze before we ever put them in the machine. If you're unfamiliar with a freeze dryer, it freezes your food or herbs in there first, and then it pulls all the moisture out by drying it. I guess that's pretty self-explanatory with the name. So it's totally unnecessary to pre-freeze anything. You can just stick them straight in your freeze dryer. But then again, one reason I might pre-freeze my herbs is when I don't have a big enough harvest. So say I picked a few calendula flowers and it wasn't enough to fill 5 trays worth, I'll just stick those in a bag and put them in the freezer. And then when I have a big enough harvest, I'll put them all together and put them in my freeze dryer. And another reason I want to mention why people might pre-freeze their herbs specifically is because herbs are so lightweight that they can be rattled around in the freeze dryer and blow off. So pre-freezing your herbs kind of weighs them down when they're frozen. In order to mitigate this when I'm using fresh herbs is I just put a paper cloth on top of my herbs. This is also a nice way to find whether the freeze dryer did their full drying process is when you pat them down on your washed herbs, you're going to get a little bit of water on the cloth. And when the freeze dryer is done, you can recognize that your cloth is all dry and all finished. Now for the actual freeze drying process. Most freeze dryers are already preset to freeze at certain temperatures and dry at certain temperatures, so you want to customize these freezing and drying temperatures. Your machine should do a pretty good job of freezing until they're solid, but then when it comes to the drying phase, I like to set it at 90 degrees Fahrenheit and no hotter because we have delicate herbs here. And then the time that it takes is usually between 24 to 48 hours. And I usually set mine for 10 hours extra because you can never over dry anything in the freeze dryer, but you can under dry it, and that can lead to spoilage. If you want to be really particular, you can weigh your herbs beforehand and after, and when they're done, you weigh them again, put them back in for a couple more hours and see if they lost any more water weight, and that means they weren't actually done. I don't usually do this. I just kind of check by crumbling them in my hands and making sure they're completely dry. Now, when it comes to storing them, you want to store your freeze-dried herbs in airtight containers away from light and moisture. Mason jars or vacuum-sealed bags work great. I like to keep my herbs as whole as possible because the more air and light that you expose to your herbs, the sooner they will degrade. So if you have a full calendula flower or lavender flowers or chamomile flowers or even leaves, I try not to crumple them up too much when I am storing them. Sometimes I can't really avoid this, and I do have to crumple them up for sake of these amount of storage that I have in a jar. So I'll push the herbs down if I don't have enough room, and that will kind of crumple them up. But for the most part, say I need some powdered herbs for a recipe, I will powder those herbs right before I use them and not beforehand. So again, like I mentioned, you want them away from oxygen and moisture, so you can use oxygen absorbers or even moisture absorbers. These are really easy to find online or through Amazon. You can get like 100 pack for like $5. You can also vacuum seal your bags or jars if you have an attachment for that. Now that we're almost through, I do want to mention that I have a link for a little discount either in the caption below or through the link in my bio. I have a Harvest Right freeze dryer and it has worked perfectly for me so far. I've really loved working with them. And an upside to those who live in Utah like me, you can go ahead and just pick up your freeze dryer yourself in Salt Lake City. I opted for doing that because the shipping times were around 3 to 4 weeks at the time, and I did not want to wait any longer for my amazing freeze dryer. A question I get a lot is, why are freeze dryers so expensive? The initial investment in a freeze drying machine can be high, but it pays off in the long run with the savings on herbs and reduced waste and even food waste. It is the absolute best way to preserve meals. So even when you're cooking a meal and you have a lot of leftovers, you can go ahead and pop those in the freeze dryer and it will store for up to 15 years as long as you store it correctly. There's so many different ways to use a freeze dryer. I am expecting my third child, so I'm actually going to be using my freeze dryer to store breast milk as well. I just remember with my first 2 kids, I was so stressed and nervous that my breast milk would go bad in the freezer. And this time around with my freeze dryer machine, I don't have to worry about that. Freeze drying is a game changer for preserving pretty much anything. The benefits in flavor, potency, and longevity of your herbs and food are well worth it. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.